morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Monika Pál and I'm representing the Hungarian Europe Society. Welcome to our afternoon session. After the fruitful discussion of the morning, we are going to have 4 panelists in the afternoon focusing on a global perspective. First, we are going to hear about the state of affairs in international relations and the changing constellation of the international order, speaking about economics, NATO, and important issues in the world order. Our first 2 panelists, Jackson James and Julia Krogan, will join us online, and then in the afternoon, the second part will be devoted to Professor Györfi and Ambassador Gyarmati. I would like everybody to speak for 15 minutes, and then in the end we are going to devote, I hope, enough time for Q&A, so your questions are most welcome. So I give the floor, without further ado, to Jackson James, who I'm going to introduce now. Mr. James is the President Emeritus of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., where he has been affiliated since 1989. Dr. James has been engaged in German-American affairs in numerous capacities over many years. Before joining AICGS, he served as Director of Program Development at the University Center for International Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He was also chair of German-speaking areas in Europe program at the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C. from 1999 to 2000, and president of the International Association for the Study of German Politics from 2005 to 2010. Dr. James is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Atlantic Council of the United States. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. James, and I give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very, very much. I feel very honored to be asked to be present at this very important meeting with so many important individuals who represent, I think, the future of democracy. With that in mind, I wanted just to take off some of the thoughts that I had actually submitted in the paper for the purposes of today. And I hope you'll bear with me and I can just repeat some of the comments that I've made in that paper. Winston Churchill famously said in 1947, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. In fact, healthy democracies are both structural as well as aspirational, constantly involving, making mistakes, and seeking to self-correct. That is what can make them successful. They are about enhancing an open society governed by laws, protecting equality and liberty, with a strong voice from the government to those governing in the form of elections. Democracy needs time to evolve and to adjust, to both change and demands, and to nourish the capacity to respond. There are many models of democracy that can vary as they are shaped by history, traditions, and political culture. But the alternative to democracy, dictatorship, autocracies, oligarchies, among others, represent hostility to liberty, representative government, and the freedom of choice, and the voice of effort to control all instruments of government. As we look out at the world of the 21st century, there is a trend which depicts an increasing threat to democracies. According to a recent report by the P-Dem Institute, the level of democracy enjoyed by average global citizens in 2021 is down to 1989 levels. The last 30 years of democratic advances are now erratic. Dictatorships are on the rise and harbor 70% of the world's population, which represents 5.4 billion people. The study found that liberal democracies can now be found in only 34 nations, down from a peak of 42 in 2012, which are home to only 13% of the world's population. Biden's Summit for Democracies, in light of the Russian aggression was the theme that I was asked to address. In this environment, President Biden convened a so-called Summit for Democracy in December of 2001. His announced purpose was to strengthen democracy at home and confront autocracies abroad while defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and advancing respect for human rights. A combination of countries attending that virtual summit reflected the varieties of approaches to those themes, with many critics pointing out inconsistencies in inviting some countries and not others. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden spoke in Warsaw in March of 2022, declaring, we emerge anew in the great battle for freedom, a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one government by brute force. And yet, the response to Vladimir Putin's war did not elicit a common global response to Biden's clarion call. The vote in the United Nations General Assembly against Russia's invasion was supported by 141 members, but 35 abstained. 6 months later, the Assembly voted to demand Russian reparations for the damage and loss of life in Ukraine. 94 supported, but 73 abstained. It appears that Biden's efforts to frame that computation between democracy and autocracy is largely resonating with Western Europe allies, and longtime U.S. partners such as Japan and Australia, and many of those abstaining countries which cannot be labeled as flourishing democracies. Indeed, such issues were evident earlier this year when Biden welcomed leaders from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Many of those attending were not experienced and committed supporters of democracy. Most recently, the G20 meeting in Bali was another demonstration of an assembly of autocracies, dictatorships, and democracy, many of which did not affiliate with the struggle between Russia and the West. Indonesia had even invited Putin to the G20 summit, who did not attend. Or take India as an example, led by Prime Minister Modi, who has had no hesitation watching clashes between Hindus and Muslims, while nurturing relations with both Moscow and Russia. For Modi, it's about securing gas and oil from Russia and sustaining border security with China and Pakistan. And then there is China, which is now in the total grasp of President Xi for a third term and possibly for life, and is increasing authoritarian. Also, China is a country that looks at Taiwan as Putin looks at Ukraine. Meanwhile, there are also critics of Biden's approach to the democracy versus autocracy slogan who claim that the United States needs to address its own problems with democracy at home. The recent midterm elections would seem to suggest that Americans are alert to those challenges following the 6th of January 2021 riots in Washington, D.C., but the fact that Donald Trump has announced his candidacy for president also reminds others that the threats have not subsided. Since then, those concerns have only been exacerbated by the refusal of many Americans, fed lies by their political leaders, to accept the election results, the continuing threats and actual acts of political violence by right-wing individuals and groups, and by primarily Republican state governments limiting voting rights access. According to a report by the Freedom House reversing the decline of democracy in the United States, there's been a 16-year decline in global freedom and democracy in the United States. That report found that the United States had dropped to a level of flawed democracies like Panama, Romania, and South Korea. The weakening of American democracy did not start with former President Trump and his direct pressure on democratic institutions and rights, and his departure from the White House has not ended that crisis. The clash of democracies and autocracies is not new to the global arena. The realities of global politics are going to require democracies and autocracies interacting with each other on issues of common concern. That was true in the period of the Cold War, and it remains today a necessity in global relations. Compromise on values is not foreign to foreign policy. Compromise on values it's not, in the summit of democracies, the Biden administration did not include certain countries, including Hungary and Turkey. Yet others were invited who were not illustrative of democratic values, such as the Philippines, Brazil, and India. Yet, the argument of the Biden administration was that the summit created openings for the civil society groups in each of these countries to reference the summit as benchmark for their domestic debates. This might echo the experience of the Helsinki Accords almost a half-century ago, which opened doors to those Eastern European and Russian dissidents. They believed that their respective countries had an alternative future, and they led to their countries to the revolutions of 1989 and 1990. The Copenhagen Democracy Summit, including building on past summits in June of 2022, was designed around building an alliance network of democracies and defined tools to respond to authoritarian systems, convening political, business, nonprofit, and civilian activists from all over the world. The United States has been actively present in that series. When President Biden announced his intention to hold Summit of Democracies, he emphasized that he was not going to repeat the democracy promotion pursued by George W. Bush, which involved military engagement. Nor was he interested in boasting about an American model of democracy for other nations to copy. His goal was to emphasize that democracies needed to be defended, strengthened, and sustained, but also reformed and to be responsive to its shortfalls. They are a challenge to prove that they can deliver to those who support them and solve the problems which confront them. Finally, he was aiming to make the case that the United States were prepared to stand with other democracies to these efforts to meet the expectations of their citizens, including Americans. We can and must join each other in helping each other to be better and stronger. The war in Ukraine has shown a bright light on the need of countries to join in confronting the existential threats to freedom and democracy everywhere. And that need is being met today by efforts of those supporting Ukraine against the aggressions of Vladimir Putin. But it is not only Ukraine that represents that need. The breeding ground for autocracies and dictatorships seated with inequality, poverty, terrorism, and insecurity among millions of people who are fearful of their futures. Seductive messages from leaders who proclaim, "I alone can fix it," are delivered in exchange for forfeiting democracy. Fiona Hill, who I'm sure you know, described this danger in her recent book, "There Is Nothing for You Here." Populism is a political approach with no fixed ideology. It can pop up on both the left and the right of political thinking and pretty much in any setting. The essence of populism is creating a direct link with the people or specific groups within the population and either surpassing or eliminating intermediaries like political parties, parliamentary representatives, and established institutions. Referenda, plebiscites, direct appeals, and exclusive orders form the substance of populism. In a way, Russia is America's ghost of Christmas future, a harbinger of things to come, if we cannot adjust course and heal our own political polarization. Ukraine is a test of the political will to sustain the resilience of democratic societies. It matters to the present and the future when it comes to promoting a rule-based order which secures stability and security for the global community. Yet, the war in Ukraine and its outcome is a challenge to the leadership of those democracies that are facing efforts to undercut that narrative. Such voices are present in many democracies, including in the United States and in European countries. Confronting those voices requires naming and shaming those who spread such arguments which nourish the populism infecting national debates. The clash of ideas comes at a pivotal moment when global instability is increasing, whether it be seen in worldwide climate change, global epidemics such as COVID-19, food insecurity, or the fear of war, even nuclear war. Fear is a fertilizer for autocracies. The response to that challenge was internally framed, I believe, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933 when he sought to assure a nervous nation caught in the depths of a national economic depression, he proclaimed, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." That clarion call was also to inspire Americans after December 1941 to turn their commitment to fighting and winning a brutal war against tyrannical dictatorships. A year earlier, Roosevelt called America an arsenal of democracies. Roosevelt's address was a call to arms for supporting Europeans to total the war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Almost 7 decades after that victory, today's challenges to democracies require additional and different arsenals, protecting democracies from different threats involving attacks by the poison of disinformation, along with the dangers of inequality and famine. In the case of the United States, the ability of Americans to find a path through their current polarized environment will be of critical global importance given its leadership role as proclaimed by President Biden at the Summit of Democracy. The worry generated around the world in the wake of the January 2021 riots were indicative of the influence events in the U.S. had on that global debate. That event delivered fodder to autocrats arguing democracy is in decline. The fact that many Americans and far-right groups show admiration to autocrats in Europe, and even for Putin, enhanced by pundits in television and radio, all of that is also indicative of a seduction of autocracies among those who subscribe to conspiracy theories and distrust institutions. That is an American dilemma, which will play out during the next 2 years in advance of the presidential election in 2024. But the developments, such as the investigations into the events of January 6th, as well as the recent election, suggest that there is a recognition of dangerous trends undermining support for and belief in democratic norms and institutions. The ongoing debate is how to respond to these trends. The U.S. does not have an unblemished track record in its foreign and domestic records, to which critics and autocracies can point in their effort to highlight weaknesses of our democracy. We Americans are not alone in that problem, but the response cannot be to become overly defensive, but rather to share the search for strategies to respond. This was the intention of the Summit of Democracies in 2021, to emphasize the fact that the United States has a leadership role to play in not just conferences, but actions taken to support democracies in the global arena. The recent midterm elections in the United States are a preview of dates to follow, of debates to follow. In the coming years beyond the midterms and the presidential election of 2024, a fundamental debate will be unfolding over the role of the United States on the international stage. It will be shaped by arguments around what we can and must do to engage in the world. The realization that the United States faces global challenges that cannot be met alone is a very different approach expounded by Donald Trump's rhetoric in the phrase America First. It has been described in the recent national security strategy of the Biden administration, which says, our alliances and partnerships around the world are the most important strategic asset and an independent element contributing to international peace and stability. A strong and united NATO, our alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and our traditional security partnerships elsewhere do not only deter aggression, they provide a platform for mutually beneficial cooperation that strengthens the international order. We place a premium on growing the connected tissue, technology, trade, security, between our democratic allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, because they recognize that they are mutually reinforcing, and the fates of the two regions, or more regions, are intertwined. The United States is a global power with global interests. We are stronger in each region because of our affirmative engagement in the others. If one region descends into chaos or is dominated by a hostile power, it will detrimentally impact our interest in the others. The need for alliances is recognized on both sides of the political aisle in the United States. What will be in discussion, as it has been in the past, is a reset of burden sharing and indeed also power sharing with our allies. The leadership in both chambers of Congress recognize the importance of independence shared with those countries who are seen as partners, but more expectations will be directed at them in the coming years. Given the weight and capacity of the European partners on the global stage in terms of their economic capacities as well as their engagement in the international network, there will be an increased emphasis on the need for European leadership in this strategic arena. That area remains an asymmetric equation at the moment in transatlantic relations. But the need for a stronger European capacity in transatlantic relations has become that much more evident in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Yet that should not result in zero-sum thinking on either side of the Atlantic. The strategic sovereignty debate in Europe is a distraction from the more important need to combine the resources of the transatlantic community in the global arena across a wide roster of areas in which security is writ large. The debate in the United States takes into consideration a clear connection between foreign and domestic policy interests, and that will be reflected in the policies focused on Ukraine. That will also be the case in Europe. Just as we must understand the war in Ukraine as the most dramatic case of the battle between democracies and autocracies, the battle is also going on elsewhere. The efforts by Russia and China to use their resources to influence many countries in the global south continue. We need to only recall the nations which abstained from the votes against Russia in the United Nations General Assembly. The weaponization of social media, as well as direct messaging to countries in Africa, Asia, and South America, has expanded in the past 2 decades. The Western democracies can not only confront threats to themselves, they also have to recognize threats elsewhere. As in the past, the ability to forge alliances across national borders will be vital to building effective and credible partners in support of democracies that are still emerging. Nadia Kovalainen has said in her essay published in The Future of Democracy by the Hungarian Europe Society, restoring international credibility, not only internal soul searching, would be imperative for mending the past wrongs on the part of the promoters of the liberal world order, strengthening the allies, convincing the unconvinced, deterring the oppressive regimes, and bigger powers in the regions of Africa, Latin America, East and South Asia is a key to the further development of the renewed liberal order in defining its geographical limits. The war will change many things, and to think that we would be able to fully reconstruct the liberal order after this heinous aggression is a self-delusion. The world of yesterday has passed away, and to preserve the essence of the liberal order, the noble idea of freedom and democracy, it should be demonstrated that we are ready to defend it as a value and review its shortcomings and blind spots. That is a statement that I would leave all of you to think about as we go into our discussions later on today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for keeping the time limit. I encourage the panelists to be that strict.